Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Today, we're tackling something that's been generating a lot of buzz in the business world.
Oh yeah, this one's a hot topic for sure.
We're diving into Holacracy.
Interesting choice.
Our main source material is Brian J. Robertson's book, Holacracy, the New Management System for a Rapidly Changing World. And we're going to try to answer the question.
Okay, shoot, what's the question?
Is Holacracy just another passing management fad? Or could it actually be the key to revolutionizing how we work?
Ooh, good question.
What do you think? Is it even possible to completely reinvent how organizations function? Or are we stuck with the same old structures?
Well, Robertson certainly makes a compelling case for a radical shift. I mean, one thing that struck me is that he's not just suggesting a few tweaks here and there.
No, not at all.
He's proposing a fundamental change to the way we think about work and organizations. It's like he's saying,
Yeah,
we need a whole new operating system, not just a software update.
exactly. And to understand why such a drastic change might be needed, he starts by really highlighting the shortcomings of traditional organizational structures.
Right. Like they just aren't cutting it anymore.
The ones we're all so used to.
Yeah.
And you know what? He uses this really interesting analogy,
Oh, I know what you're talking about. The one with,
the airplane,
yes, the airplane.
where he almost crashes a plane.
Yeah. As a student pilot, he ignored this warning light
During his student pilot days. Yeah,
because it seemed like a minor issue, right? Like all the other instruments looked fine.
right. It was like a low voltage warning or something, but
Turns out ignoring that one seemingly insignificant signal,
almost cost him the flight.
yeah, could have been really bad. And, you know, as a passenger, it's a bit unsettling to hear.
A little bit. I was like, oh, great. So this is what happens when people ignore the little things.
Exactly. But it is a really effective analogy, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Because it perfectly illustrates how these traditional hierarchies often fail to see those crucial pieces of information.
The ones that are right in front of them.
Yeah.
Like those low voltage warnings that might be coming from, say, individual employees.
Exactly.
Who, might have valuable insights, but they kind of get lost in all the noise of a top-down system.
Exactly. It's like the organization's senses are dulled.
Right.
Robertson argues that these companies often suffer from taking in more information than they can actually process.
Oh, interesting. So it's like they're overstimulated.
In a way, yeah, like they're overwhelmed, and this leads to missed opportunities and an inability to adapt to change. He has this great line, I love this, he says, more companies die of indigestion than starvation.
Wow. That's such a powerful way to put it.
Right, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. So is holacracy the answer to this organizational indigestion?
Well, Robertson certainly presents it as a solution.
Okay.
He positions holacracy as a way to fundamentally change how power and authority function.
Okay, so less about the person at the top calling all the shots.
Yeah. And more about distributing authority throughout the organization.
Okay, so like a network instead of a pyramid.
You got it.
I'm starting to see how that could address those ignored low voltage warnings.
Right. If you have more people empowered to make decisions and act on information,
Yeah.
you're more likely to catch those crucial signals before they become major problems.
That makes sense. But wouldn't that kind of distributed authority create chaos?
Well, it might seem that way initially, but holacracy actually aims to bring structure and clarity
Okay.
within that distributed authority. It's not about anarchy.
No.
It's about moving from a system of bosses and subordinates
Okay.
to a system of clearly defined roles and accountabilities.
Ah, I see. So instead of relying on personalities and power dynamics,
Yeah.
everyone operates within this framework that empowers them while also setting clear expectations.
Exactly. Robertson argues that this can actually lead to greater trust and autonomy because you're removing that ambiguity and guesswork. Oh, I see. That makes sense.
He quotes someone in the book saying that it can feel a bit uncivilized at first.
Uncivilized. That's interesting.
Yeah, because it disrupts our ingrained habits of relying on these unspoken norms.
Right. And those kind of hidden power dynamics.
Exactly.
You know, it's funny, because how many times have we complained about unclear expectations at work?
Oh, all the time.
Or having to constantly figure out who's responsible for what?
Right. It's like a constant source of frustration.
Maybe a little uncivilized honesty is exactly what we need.
Maybe so. And that's precisely the point Robertson is making. By making these roles and accountabilities explicit, Holacracy aims to reduce those common organizational frustrations.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. How does this distribution of authority actually play out in a holacracy-powered organization? What are the building blocks?
Well, you can't talk about holacracy without talking about circles.
Circles, like a drum circle. Should I bring my bongos?
Not quite, though that would make meetings more interesting.
Think of circles more like a series of interconnected teams, each one having a really clear purpose and a defined set of responsibilities.
Ah, okay, so these circles were like the fundamental organizational units within holacracy.
Exactly. And each circle has its own structure
Oh, interesting.
and operates with a high degree of autonomy.
Okay.
And then within each circle, you have individuals filling specific roles.
Right.
And each of those roles has clearly defined accountabilities.
So instead of having some vague job description, you know exactly what you're responsible for.
Yes.
And how that contributes to the bigger purpose of the circle.
Precisely. It's about moving from a world of do whatever your boss tells you to here are the things I'm accountable for, and I have the authority to make decisions and take action within that scope.
Okay.
And if there's a tension, meaning a gap between what is and what could be,
Right.
you have a clear process for addressing it.
Oh, this tension processing thing. We have to dig into that more.
Oh, absolutely. Tension processing is at the heart of how holacracy adapts. Instead of letting those frustrations fester or relying on, informal back channels.
Oh, the dreaded water cooler gossip.
Exactly. Holacracy gives you a structured way to bring tensions to the surface,
Okay.
and then you can work through them constructively.
So it's like a pressure valve that prevents the whole system from exploding.
That's a great way to put it.
I like that analogy.
It allows the organization to evolve in a more conscious way.
So how does this tension processing actually work in practice?
Yeah.
Do you have a designated complainer in each circle?
Not quite. Holacracy has defined processes for capturing and processing these tensions. It all revolves around two types of meetings:
Two types of meetings.
governance meetings and tactical meetings.
Okay, so meetings still exist in this brave new world of holacracy.
They do, but with a very specific purpose. Governance meetings, that's where you work on the organization. That's where you're defining and evolving the structure.
So defining the circles and roles.
Yeah, modifying them.
Maybe even getting rid of some.
Even scrapping them all together. It's about adapting the structure to fit the work.
Okay, so tactical meetings. That's where the actual work gets done.
Exactly. Tactical meetings are where you work in the organization, focusing on the day-to-day operations.
Okay, so governance is about defining the what of the work.
Right.
Tactical is about the how.
You got it.
Robertson seems to really emphasize these meetings, though. It's like, do we really need even more meetings?
Well, it's not about adding meetings just for the sake of it. It's about having the right meetings. He talks about this concept of slowing down to speed up.
Slowing down to speed up.
Mm.
Okay, I've heard that before, but how does it apply here?
It means investing the time in governance and structure
Yeah.
so you can operate more efficiently and effectively in the long run.
So instead of constantly putting out fires,
Right.
you're taking the time to design a system that prevents those fires in the first place.
Exactly. It's like taking the time to sharpen your saw before you try to cut down a tree. It might seem counterintuitive,
Right.
but you end up saving time and energy.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, I'm still a bit skeptical about some of holacracy's more, let's say, radical ideas.
Oh, like what?
Like abandoning deadline commitments
Oh, yeah.
in favor of transparency and trust. How does that even work?
Sounds crazy, right?
Don't deadlines keep people accountable and make sure things actually get done?
That's what we've always been told.
Right.
But Robertson actually argues that those fixed deadlines often create this false sense of security and can lead to wasted effort.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
Instead of focusing on arbitrary deadlines,
Right.
holacracy encourages a system of clear priorities
Okay.
and then open communication about progress.
So instead of promising of what by when, it's more about honesty.
Right, being honest about what's possible
Yeah.
and then adjusting as needed.
Okay, so it's more about being flexible and responsive to change rather than trying to force things to fit into a predetermined timeline.
Exactly. And that fosters more accurate projections and, more conscious prioritization, which is essential in a rapidly changing world. Remember, it's about dynamic steering, not rigid plans.
Dynamic steering, like navigating a speedboat through choppy waters.
More like riding a bicycle through city traffic.
Okay.
It's about constantly adjusting your course based on real-time feedback and being open to changing direction if you need to. Which actually brings us to another really key aspect of holacracy.
Oh.
Strategy.
Strategy. This should be good. I'm always fascinated by how organizations try to plan for the future, especially in today's unpredictable world.
Well, you might be surprised to hear that Holacracy doesn't really believe in traditional strategic
Wait,
plan.
what? No strategic plans. How do they know where they're going?
It's not that they're sailing without a compass,
Okay.
but they approach strategy in a much more dynamic and emergent way. Robertson argues that these traditional strategic plans, they often get outdated almost as soon as you write them.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen that happen so many times.
Right. And those rigid plans can blind you to new opportunities and prevent you from adapting when circumstances change. So instead, Holacracy encourages what they call dynamic steering.
So instead of trying to predict the future and create this detailed roadmap, you're constantly sensing and responding to what's happening in the present.
Exactly. It's about having a clear understanding of your overall direction and then empowering those individuals and teams to make decisions that align with that
Okay.
in real time.
So how do you actually set a strategic direction in Holacracy without creating those rigid plans?
Well, Robertson talks about expressing strategy
Yeah.
in a way that's more like a compass than a map.
Okay.
He gives this example of a strategy that's phrased as emphasize X even over Y.
Emphasize X even over Y. Okay, that's pretty different from those typical corporate strategy documents I've seen. Those are usually like 100 pages long.
Right. But it's a powerful way to guide decision making.
So instead of getting lost in all those detailed plans and projections, you have this clear guiding principle.
Right.
That helps you prioritize.
Yes.
Even when you're faced with several good options.
Exactly. It's about making conscious choices about where you focus your energy. And that's such a crucial skill these days when there are just so many opportunities.
And distractions.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like you have to constantly be filtering and prioritizing.
Yeah. It's about staying focused on what truly matters.
You know, it's interesting how Holacracy ties everything back to this idea of adaptability. It's almost like they designed a system that's built for constant evolution.
You're picking up on a key theme here.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's exactly what Robertson argues.
Okay.
He says Holacracy brings the principles of evolution inside companies.
Wait, are we talking Darwinian evolution here? Like survival of the fittest within an organization?
Well, not in a cutthroat sense, but in terms of those fundamental principles of variation, selection, and adaptation.
Okay, you've got me intrigued. Tell me more. How can a management system actually mimic biological evolution?
Robertson breaks it down into how Holacracy mirrors the four key elements.
Okay.
First, you've got encoding,
Okay.
which is kind of like the organization's DNA.
Right.
And in Holacracy, this is represented by the governance process.
So that's where you're defining the structure of the rules.
Exactly. It's the blueprint for how the organization is built.
Okay, what's next?
Then you have expression. So that's how the DNA actually shows up in the real world.
Right.
And in Holacracy, this is the roles and accountabilities.
Okay.
So they are like the genes
The gene. Okay.
that determine the specific functions of the organization.
Okay, so we have the blueprint.
Yes.
We have the genes. What about the mutations?
That's where variation comes in. It's the constant process of identifying and adapting to changes.
Okay.
So in Holacracy, this is the tension processing.
Right. Where you're constantly looking for ways to improve.
Yeah. And proposing changes
To the governance.
to the roles.
It's like those mutations that allow an organism to evolve and adapt to new challenges. Okay, so we've got encoding, expression, variation. What's the final piece of the evolutionary puzzle?
Selection. That's the process of figuring out which variations are beneficial and which ones aren't.
Okay.
In nature, this happens through natural selection, right? The ones that are best adapted survive.
Right, survival of the fittest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In Holacracy, this happens through the feedback loops that are built into the system.
So if something's not working, you don't just keep doing it because that's how it's always been done.
Right.
You actually have a way to change course.
Exactly. It's about figuring out what works and then amplifying that.
Okay, I'm starting to really see how this all ties together, but I'm also wondering about the human element. How does working in a Holacracy-powered organization actually feel? Is it really empowering or just another form of control?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that a lot of people have when they first encounter this.
Right.
It is a different way of working.
Yeah.
And it does require a shift in mindset.
A shift from what to what?
Well, Robertson talks about this common experience of shifting from a parent-child dynamic with managers to one of autonomy and accountability.
So instead of always looking to your boss for directions or approval, you're empowered to make decisions and really take ownership.
Exactly. It's like shifting from a culture of permission-seeking to a culture of taking responsibility.
That sounds both incredibly liberating and potentially terrifying.
I know. It's a big change.
Not everyone thrives in an environment where they're expected to be that self-directed
You're right. It takes a certain level of maturity.
and self-awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. But for those who can embrace it, it can be really empowering.
Okay. So Robertson also talks about how this shift in power dynamics can lead to a more authentic and empathetic work environment. Is that something you've actually observed?
Oh, absolutely. When you remove the need to constantly navigate office politics or please those in authority,
Right.
you create space for more open and honest communication.
So instead of trying to fit into these predefined boxes or play the corporate game,
Mm,
people can bring their whole selves to work and contribute their unique talents and perspectives.
exactly. And that can lead to deeper connections,
Yeah.
more effective collaborations.
And ultimately, a more fulfilling work experience.
exactly.
Well, this is all very exciting, but I also wonder about the practical side of things. Can any organization adopt Holacracy? Or are there certain types of companies where it's a better fit?
That's where things get really interesting because Holacracy is a system, not just a set of tools.
Right.
Robertson is really emphatic about it needing to be fully embraced if you want to see those results.
So you can't just cherry pick the parts you like and expect it to work the same way.
Nope. He actually calls that stopping short syndrome.
Stopping short syndrome.
Interesting. And he says that can be even worse than not adopting Holacracy at all,
How so?
because you end up with this weird hybrid system.
Right, where some people are doing things the old way
Right.
and some people are trying to do things this new way.
And everyone's confused. So it creates more problems than it solves.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's why it's crucial to really grasp those core principles of Holacracy
Hmm.
and approach it as a holistic system.
Okay, so full adoption is ideal.
Yes.
But what about those of us who work in more traditional organizations?
Right.
Are there still ways we can benefit from these principles without, completely overhauling everything?
Absolutely. Not every organization is ready to jump all in with Holacracy, and that's okay.
Yeah.
There are still some really valuable techniques
Yeah.
that you can apply within those traditional structures.
So even if we can't fully implement Holacracy, we can still borrow some of its wisdom to make our workplaces better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For example, the concept of tension processing. That can be incredibly valuable in any organization,
Okay.
regardless of how it's structured.
It strikes me that even just thinking about work through the lens of Holacracy can be helpful. It challenges us to question our assumptions and look for ways to be more effective and humane. I agree. And that's ultimately what I find so exciting about Holacracy. It's not just a set of rules, it's a mindset shift
Right.
that can help us create more adaptable, efficient, and, more human-centered organizations.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today,
We have.
exploring the core principles of Holacracy
From distributing authority
to adaptability and evolution.
and everything in between.
But before we wrap up this first part,
Okay.
I want to bring it back to you,
To the listeners.
to the listeners. What does all this mean for you?
It's an invitation to explore, to experiment,
Yeah.
to challenge the status quo. Even if you never fully adopt Holacracy, the principles and practices we're discussing today can offer valuable insights for your organization.
To make it more adaptable
More efficient.
and ultimately more human.
Exactly. It's fascinating how Holacracy challenges some of those assumptions we have about how organizations should work. It's like we're looking at it through a whole different lens.
It really is.
Hmm.
I'm finding myself questioning a lot of things about work and leadership that I kind of just took for granted before.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, this idea of stopping short syndrome, I'm still kind of grappling with that.
Yeah, that's a big one.
How do you actually know if you're truly embracing Holacracy or if you're just, dipping your toes in?
That's a great question, and it's something Robertson addresses in the book.
Okay.
He says one of the biggest mistakes organizations make is trying to implement Holacracy piecemeal.
Okay.
Like they adopt certain elements, but they're still clinging to those old power structures and habits.
This is like trying to mix oil and water. You just end up with this messy, ineffective concoction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to understand those underlying principles of Holacracy and approach it as a holistic system.
Okay, but let's be realistic. Not every organization's going to be ready or able to do a complete Holacracy makeover, right?
Right?
What about those of us who work in more traditional settings? Are there ways to apply some of these principles without, completely upending everything.
Absolutely. While full adoption might be ideal,
Okay.
there are definitely valuable lessons and techniques that can be applied,
Yeah.
even in those traditional organizations.
So even if we can't fully implement Holacracy, we can still borrow some of its wisdom to make our workplaces a bit better.
Exactly.
Like, for example, the concept of tension processing.
Yeah.
Incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
In any organization,
Okay.
regardless of the structure.
Okay, remind me, how does tension processing work? Is it just a fancy way of saying complaining constructively?
It's more than just complaining, though. It's about having that structured way to identify and address those gaps between what is and what could be.
Yeah, I think a lot of us experience that feeling of tension at work, but we don't always have a healthy way to deal with it. We either just bottle it up or end up venting to our colleagues, which doesn't really solve anything. Exactly. And that's where that defined process can be so valuable. It allows you to bring those issues to the surface, but in a way that's actually constructive.
Okay.
And then you can work together to find solutions.
And what about those governance and tactical meetings that we talked about earlier? Could those be adapted for a more traditional setting?
Definitely. The principles behind those meetings are incredibly valuable,
Okay.
like focusing on roles and accountabilities and separating that governance from operations.
Okay.
That can be helpful in any organization.
Okay, so even if we're not ready for full-on holacracy, we can experiment with some of the elements and see if they make a positive impact.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, holacracy is still evolving. It's not the static system. It's constantly adapting.
Right. It's like that evolutionary analogy we were talking about.
Exactly. And one of the areas where it's continuing to evolve is in its approach to compensation.
Oh, compensation. Now that's a topic that always gets people's attention. How does holacracy handle that?
Well, it challenges a lot of the traditional assumptions about how compensation should work.
Yeah.
Instead of relying on, those hierarchical pay grades and those annual performance reviews.
Right, yeah.
Holacracy actually encourages a more dynamic and flexible approach.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Robertson talks about moving away from this idea of a fixed salary.
Right.
That's tied to a specific job title.
Okay.
And moving towards a system that recognizes and rewards individuals based on their actual contributions and the roles they fill.
So instead of climbing this predetermined ladder, you're essentially building your own career path based on your skills and your interests.
Exactly. And that aligns perfectly with the whole idea of self-management and empowering people to take ownership of their work.
That sounds pretty radical, but incredibly exciting at the same time. It's like flipping the script on the traditional corporate career model.
It is. And it's something that we see more organizations starting to explore as they grapple with attracting and retaining top talent.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the mechanics of holacracy, but let's shift gears a little bit and explore the more human side of it. What's it actually like to work in an organization that's powered by holacracy? Is it truly as liberating and empowering as people claim it is?
That's a great question, and one that a lot of people have. From my experience, working in a holacracy-powered organization is both exhilarating and challenging. It's definitely not for everybody.
What kind of person thrives in a holacracy environment?
You need to be comfortable with autonomy and ambiguity.
Okay.
You have to be a self-starter, willing to take initiative, and you can't be someone who's constantly seeking approval.
So it's not a place for micromanagers or those who just really crave a lot of structure and direction.
Not at all. In fact, one of the biggest challenges is letting go of that need for control.
Right.
Learning to trust the process.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big shift, especially if you've spent your entire career working in those traditional hierarchical organizations.
It is. But for those who can embrace it, it's really rewarding.
What are some of the rewards you've personally experienced?
Well, one of the biggest is a sense of ownership and purpose.
Okay.
When you're working in a holacracy-powered organization, you're not just following orders.
Right.
You're contributing to the success of the organization.
You're not just a cog in the machine. You're a vital part of the organism.
Exactly. You're making a real difference.
Okay.
And you're empowered to make those decisions that impact the direction of the organization.
It's like you're an entrepreneur, but within a company.
That's a great way to put it. And the entrepreneurial spirit is really encouraged in holacracy.
Robertson also talks about how holacracy can lead to a more authentic and empathetic work environment. Is that something that's been true for you?
Oh, absolutely. When you don't have to play political games or constantly worry about who's in charge,
Right.
it creates space for more honest communication.
So less backstabbing.
Oh, for sure.
more collaboration.
Exactly. It's just a much healthier work environment overall.
This whole idea of working in a system that's based on trust and transparency, that really appeals to me. It's a far cry from those, cutthroat corporate cultures we often hear about.
It is, and it's something that I think a lot of people are looking for.
Yeah.
We're so tired of the politics, the bureaucracy, that feeling that we're just cogs in a machine.
Right. We want to feel like our work matters.
Exactly.
And we want to work in places where we can just be ourselves and connect with people in a way that's meaningful.
Exactly. And that's what Holacracy is all about. It's about those organizations that are more human, more adaptable, more aligned with what people actually need.
Okay, this has been a super insightful conversation. But before we wrap up part 2 here, I do want to touch on one more topic that comes up a lot with Holacracy.
Oh, what's that?
Leadership.
Okay, yeah.
What happens to the traditional role of a manager in a Holacracy-powered organization?
Right.
Does the concept of leadership even exist anymore?
That's a great question, and Robertson actually addresses that directly in the book. He says Holacracy doesn't get rid of leadership.
Oh, okay.
It actually distributes it
Oh, interesting.
throughout the entire organization.
So instead of having a few people at the top calling all the shots,
Right.
you have leadership kind of emerging from within each circle in each role.
Exactly. And that can be really empowering for everyone involved.
But doesn't that create the potential for chaos
Sure.
or confusion? How do you make sure everyone's on the same page without, a clear leader at the top?
Well, that's where the Holacracy Constitution comes in. Remember, it's not about getting rid of structure or process.
Right.
It's about creating a framework that actually enables distributed leadership.
Okay, remind me, what's the Holacracy Constitution again?
It's essentially that set of rules
Yeah.
that defines how the organization operates. It outlines the roles, the accountabilities, the decision-making processes.
So it's like the operating system that keeps everything running smoothly.
Exactly. And because it's constantly evolving. Yeah.
Through that governance process,
Right.
it makes sure the organization's always adapting.
What about those people who were in those traditional leadership positions before they implemented Holacracy? How did they adapt to this new way of working?
It can be a challenge for some people, for sure.
Yeah.
Letting go of that control
Right.
and embracing a more distributed approach to leadership,
Yeah.
it can be difficult.
Yeah. Especially if they're used to being the one in charge.
Exactly. It's almost like they have to unlearn everything they thought they knew about leadership.
In a way, yeah. But what about for those who are willing to make that shift?
Right.
Is it rewarding?
Oh, incredibly so.
Yeah.
One of the biggest rewards is a sense of liberation.
Okay.
When you're no longer burdened by the weight of making every single decision or controlling every outcome,
Yeah.
you're free to focus on what you're good at, what you're passionate about.
So instead of getting bogged down in the day-to-day stuff,
Right.
you can focus on that bigger picture.
Yes.
Contribute your unique talents. Exactly. And that can be a much more fulfilling experience, a more impactful one, too.
I'm really starting to see how Holacracy challenges so many of our ideas about work, about leadership,
Yeah.
about organizational structure. It's not just a new way of doing things. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking.
I completely agree. And that's what's so interesting. Even for people who aren't ready to go all in on Holacracy, it forces us to question those assumptions. Like, why do we work the way we do?
Right.
Is there a better way?
It's like holding a mirror up to our organizations and asking, is this really the best we can do?
Exactly. And it's a question that more and more organizations are starting to ask, especially as the world gets more complex and uncertain.
Well, this has been a fascinating look at Holacracy, but we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Let's take a quick break,
Okay.
and we'll come back to wrap up this whole deep dive.
Sounds good. We'll see you soon.
Okay, so we're back, ready to wrap up this deep dive into Holacracy. It's amazing how the system just seems to touch on so many different things when it comes to work. From the really practical things like, who does what?
Right. Roles and responsibilities.
Exactly. To these bigger questions.
Yeah.
Like, what's the purpose of it all?
Yeah. The big existential questions.
Exactly. Robertson paints this really compelling picture of an organization where people are like truly energized and engaged in what they do.
Yeah, he makes it sound pretty utopian.
He does. But is that actually achievable?
Well, it's definitely the goal, but I think we have to acknowledge that no system is perfect.
Right. There's no magic bullet.
Exactly. Holacracy has its limitations just like anything else.
So you're saying there will always be those bumps in the road, especially during that initial transition.
Oh, for sure. But what I appreciate about Holacracy is that it gives you a way to approach those challenges.
Okay.
It's more conscious, more intentional.
So even when things get messy, which, let's be honest, they do in any organization,
Always.
you have a way to work through those challenges and come out stronger.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the key differences between Holacracy and other systems. It's not about finding a perfect solution.
Right.
It's about having a system that can evolve and adapt as things change.
It's like building adaptability right into the organization's DNA.
I love that. And it makes so much sense in today's world.
Right.
Because the one thing you can count on is change.
Yeah. I feel like things are changing faster than ever.
Exactly. Organizations have to be able to move quickly,
Yeah.
adapt,
Yeah.
innovate, just to keep up.
And Holacracy seems to offer a way to do that,
Yeah.
not through top-down control, but by actually empowering individuals.
Empowerment, yes, and creating a system that can evolve quickly.
Exactly. It's interesting to think about the bigger implications of this.
The ripple effects.
Yeah. If this system really does make organizations more adaptable and innovative,
Yeah.
what could that mean for society?
Wow. That's a big question.
I know, right? Could this model work for something like, say, government?
Interesting. Right.
Could it help us tackle those big global challenges we're facing?
It's like Holacracy is pointing toward a different way of being in the world, one that's less about, hierarchies and control
Right? The old ways.
and more about collaboration.
Adaptation.
Yeah, working together.
Collective intelligence.
Okay, before we get too carried away with these, big ideas about the future,
Right, back down to earth.
I want to talk about something that I'm sure a lot of our listeners are thinking about,
Okay.
the potential downsides. Is there anything we should be, cautious about?
That's a great question, and of course there are. Like any system.
Right.
Holacracy has potential pitfalls.
Okay.
One thing Robertson talks about is gaming the system.
Oh, right. So, like, people trying to figure out how to exploit the rules to benefit themselves.
Exactly. And because Holacracy really depends on those clear roles and accountabilities.
Yeah. There's always a risk someone might try to manipulate that.
Okay, so are there ways to prevent that? Safeguard?
Absolutely. That's where the principles of transparency and accountability come in.
Right.
When everything's out in the open,
Yeah.
everyone's responsible for what they do.
Okay.
It's harder to get away with that kind of stuff.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of Holacracy. It builds that culture of integrity.
Okay, that's reassuring. But even with those safeguards in place, it still seems like implementing Holacracy successfully requires a certain level of maturity.
Absolutely. It's not a quick fix. It takes a lot of self-awareness.
Yeah, and a willingness to change.
Exactly. A commitment to learning.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's more of a journey.
I like that, a journey.
Right. And it requires careful planning
Adaptation.
and a deep understanding of how the system works and what the organization needs.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, this has been eye-opening, to say the least.
I agree.
I've learned so much about Holacracy and its potential to, really change the way we think about work.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you. I hope our listeners found it insightful as well.
I'm sure they did. And if you're out there listening and you want to dive deeper,
There's more to learn.
oh yeah, we've got tons of resources over on our website, links to Brian Robertson's book, articles about Holacracy.
Check it out.
And if you've experimented with Holacracy, let us know.
We want to hear from you.
Yeah, share your comments. Let's keep this conversation going.
Till next time.
Keep diving deep. See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.